beginning of the year, I decided to embark on a sewing journey. I'm basically sewing all of my clothes and not buying any new ones this year. More on how I got to that point in a minute. But while sharing this challenge/goal with all of you on Instagram and TikTok, I realized a lot of people are interested in how I got started learning to sew, and so I will be answering the most common questions I got from y'all. We will be covering following topics: my journey, so my first project, how I started, learning to sew on the internet, what do I watch and how do I learn, fabric, patterns, and at the end, the most commonly asked question was, what's the first step? And also, beginner tips and mindset. Let's go.
Can someone tell me the proper path of sew? Anyways, the first thing I sewed was 3 years ago with my grandma. We made this hoodie with patterns and it turned out really well. But then I literally didn't touch a sewing machine for 3 years because school, and I wasn't that interested. Oh yeah, and in those 3 years, I had to let go of the dream of creating my own clothing brand. I wanted to make the perfect hoodie, but the reason I let go of that dream is because, let me take a sip of matcha. I let go of that dream because I learned more about sustainability and just made the realization for myself that consuming, selling, using resources, producing is not really helping the planet. What helps the planet is if people have the mindset that the less you buy, the less you produce, the better, the less new, the better, and the best thing is to reuse what already exists. So at the end of last year, 2020, I was at a point where I was kind of interested in sewing and I felt like no one would be able to create my dream wardrobe better than myself because I knew what I wanted, in the pieces. I ended up with the idea of challenging myself to not buy any new clothes in 2021 and use my new interest in sewing to my benefit and try to design and sew my own clothes. I don't really know how I got to a point of feeling so confident that I could sew my own clothes, but somehow I was there and I was just digging into inspiration. So now let's talk about how to learn sewing with the help of the internet. I don't think there's a guide to where to start. We're gonna be talking about beginner tips in a moment, but honestly, just start with what interests you. So instead of, taking a sewing course and learning all the fundamentals and all of the techniques, I just went by the garment I want to make and kind of learned accordingly. So I feel like that could be a helpful tip to anyone who's starting out. Start with what interests you because then you're gonna have enough passion to also put in all of the work to learn it. And honestly, to me, that is one of the most fun aspects about sewing, that when I'm sewing something new, I'm guaranteed to learn something new and have to learn something new. So I'm constantly growing, but I'm growing while making items that I actually want to do and I'm interested in and have fun making. If down the road your goal is to sew dresses, start by watching dress tutorials without even starting to make a dress, just to wrap your head around it and get an understanding of how a dress comes together. And then you'll realize, oh, I want to make such a dress. Oh, I need to learn this technique. And then you can look for tutorials and specific techniques. Now, I'm personally at a point where more often than not, I only research a specific technique because I already know some basics on, for example, if I want to make a dress, I know how to put it together. But then if I want to make a wrap dress, I just look up the specific technique on how to make it a wrap dress. That's basically how I puzzle together resources and tutorials on how to make one specific item.
listing all of my favorite resources and creators in the description box, so go and have a look. And if you have recommendations for resources about sewing and sustainable fashion, leave them in the comments down below. I'm sure they will be greatly appreciated by all of us.
But I want to talk about oh my god. One question I got a lot was, where do I get my patterns from? And because I mentioned that I do make some of my patterns myself, the question is how I make these. So let's go, patterns. We just talked about how I use YouTube tutorials to learn, am I right? Now, a lot of YouTube videos, actually, these generous creators offer free patterns with the tutorial that they're making, which is amazing. So I would say the first place to look for patterns is YouTube videos or TikToks. Because a lot of times these content creators are going to be offering free patterns with the tutorial, as I just said, or they've made patterns that they sell on their website or on Etsy, which I find amazing. So if you're beginning, I think it would definitely be worth it to buy a pattern from someone who makes YouTube tutorials, because you're gonna find a lot more answers than if you were to use a pattern from a book, which is amazing too. I've done that in the past, not too much. The only book I've used a pattern from is this one. I did make a pair of pants with it. Books are amazing, but I'm just saying that YouTube videos offer so much more opportunity to be in-depth and also kind of interactive. You're a Google search away from finding an amazing pattern on a blog or on a website that sells different kinds of patterns.
My first tip would be to watch a tutorial on how to sew with patterns, like this one. Once you're comfortable with using patterns, you can start adjusting, altering, and copying them with little changes until you have a grasp on how to draw them yourself. My second tip would be to start copying your own clothes. Here's a video on how to do that. With some practice, you'll learn how to dissect a piece of clothing into its original parts, and then to convert those shapes onto paper.
Pattern making in itself is a huge skill. You're definitely not required to understand it or be good at it to be able to sew your own clothes. I personally am just super interested in how pieces are put together and how they come together. So I do want to know how to make a good pattern. And especially, I just want to be a pro at creating clothing pieces that fit me. And that's a whole nother topic, like measuring properly and understanding how to convert your measurements into a piece of clothing, depending on the fabric, depending on the cut that you're working on. But as I said, start with learning how to copy your own clothes and then work from there. Let's talk about fabric. I did get questions about where I get my fabric and how I find fabric that's sustainable. What is the most sustainable fabric? Now, you may already know the answer if you heard what I said at the beginning of this video, but it's basically fabric that we wouldn't buy new. So fabric from pieces of clothing that already exist, old blankets, old bed sheets, any fabric you can find that is already made. I still go thrifting. I still buy thrifted clothes because I have a lot of fun remaking pieces of clothing, and also I always scavenge for fabric I can use to make something new even. That would be my number one option. Keep in mind you can probably also find secondhand fabrics online, so check that out. Check out Etsy and check out other places where you could find secondhand fabric. Especially if you're starting out, I can highly recommend just buying a big old t-shirt from the thrift store that's super cheap and sewing with that, because that's going to be cheaper than buying new fabric. What I look for in new fabrics in terms of sustainability is, first of all, what type of fabric it is, and then how much water it uses to be produced, how long it lasts, how it's dyed, where it's made, and if it's certified for, there's like different certifications. And I just try I just try my best to get the best fabric I can. And also if there's, a more expensive one that is better quality, I'm gonna get that. A last thing I wanted to mention, speaking about fabrics, is the cost. Now, I just said that I personally do like to spend more money if the fabric is gonna be better quality, because in terms of sustainability, it is going to last longer and that is more sustainable. And I can also acknowledge that fabrics these days that you're gonna find that are marked as more sustainable are probably going to be more expensive because they're more rare. But hopefully that is going to change in the future as more people and manufacturers adapt to methods that leave a smaller footprint on the earth. I would just definitely recommend diving into fabrics, going to a fabric store, feeling fabric, if it's possible to go to a fabric store. Feel the fabric, or if you can only order fabrics online, order samples, test it out, look at the fabrics of the clothes you already own and try to understand what which fabric is used for. What's the first step? People don't really know where to start. Where's the start line, So let's talk about what my process is. I mentioned earlier that once I started this challenge, I already had a lot of ideas of what I want to sew. And I assume if you are planning to sew your own clothes, that you do have some ideas as well. It could also be the case that you just want to sew, meaning you don't really know what exactly. So then I would recommend going thrifting and finding something that you can upgrade, that you can fit to yourself, and start out like that. But if you have something specific in mind, what I usually do is, so I have this whole book where I print out ideas from the internet, usually Pinterest. And these are all items made from other people. So here are 8 pieces of clothes that I made in the first round, and those are the 8 pieces that I filmed for this video that you're watching right now, but it was too boring. And the process is gonna look different for every single item. So for this dress, I literally just followed a YouTube tutorial. I watched a tutorial, I wrote down all of the steps, I wrote down the measurements to cut the fabric, and basically just recapped what they said in the video so that I could understand it in my own words and remember it for the future. So that's one tip of mine, to write down all of the steps of making a garment before you actually make a garment. For my most recent project, which was my perfect hoodie, which is now in the laundry because I wore it so much, I basically made the pattern from a sweater that my friend had. I literally copied every centimeter and wrote it down on this piece of paper right here. From that, I made a pattern. So I drew the pattern on pattern paper. Now, once I had the pattern, I was kind of lost. So I started watching tutorials on how to make hoodies and what the best process is, like which step comes first and which step comes next. And of course, some steps in sewing are interchangeable. But here's one thing about sewing that it's kind of unbelievable I haven't mentioned until now. Sewing has a lot to do with planning, with thinking through all of the notions you're going to go through. I think that's why I emphasized so much earlier on grasping how clothes are made, because it's truly going to help you in the process of learning to sew. But the more you understand about making clothes, the more you're going to understand when what needs to happen. But I feel like not just for making something once, also to refer back to the future, to write notes afterwards on what you could have done better. It makes so much sense to write down basically the recipe for what you're making. From your pattern, you can already measure how much fabric you need. Always order a little bit more fabric. No one's perfect. Sometimes we miscalculate something. Sometimes we forget that our hoodie has a hood and it's a double layered hood. I usually order about 10 to 20% more fabric. If I don't end up needing the fabric, of course, I continue using it in the future. Okay, on the topic of creating less waste. The reason I made a collection and planned out what I'm sewing to begin with was so that I could get accurate amounts of fabric and that I could sew those things and then be done with them before I order a bunch of new fabric. So I personally go by plan, and I feel like that's a way where I can reduce waste by not just randomly going out and buying fabric, not being sure if I'm gonna use it. Of course, if you find a fabric you're super inspired by and think this is the only moment you can buy the fabric, honey. But I would personally just get a sample of that fabric, plan out a project, and then buy the fabric. I've actually gotten a lot of questions about mistakes to avoid, and I am going to mention a few things, but honestly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are the best learning indicators of what to remember for the future. And it's inevitable that you're going to make mistakes. So don't be too afraid of that, especially with making clothes. If you understand how to make something, you're also probably going to understand how to reverse the mistake, and hopefully you're going to have some spare fabric. And I hate to break it to you, you're definitely going to miscalculate measurements and have to redo seams because of sizing. Sizing is extremely difficult. Don't be too hard on yourself. I, every single time, need to adjust what I'm sewing. Even though I measure it on myself, I make a pattern and I feel like it fits. Sometimes it's still not gonna fit. Like, the end result is always going to fall differently than you plan it. So I think it's healthy to just expect you to have to make adjustments, which honestly, just be grateful that you're slowly getting to understand how to even make adjustments, and that's such a good skill to have. I've also mentioned this earlier actually, but this mistake that I've made a couple of times is not sewing something in the right order, and then basically you have to go back because you need to, for example, insert something somewhere. That's why, again, I highly recommend writing down all of your steps in the right order and thinking your item through. Now, this is definitely not gonna avoid all mistakes, as I said earlier. Definitely avoid the most significant mistakes that you could be making. It's okay to feel frustrated when you're making something, and it's definitely a good option then to just take a break, take a step back, put it away. You should not continue sewing, as I also mentioned earlier, if it's not fun. So honestly, just wait until you feel inspired again. I think if you're sewing for fun, then nothing should really be stressing you. Also, I realized that myself that even with a plan to sew specific things, I wasn't able to schedule, I'm gonna sew this week and that week. I just listened to what I felt like sewing, and then the sewing process was so much more fun. And it just flowed, If you feel inspired to sew a pair of pants today, do it today, Don't postpone it to another month and sew something else before. Really do what interests you most, because that's how you're gonna progress most and enjoy the process most, which is the most important thing. This is not going to become a sewing channel. I'm struggling actually to balance sewing for fun and monetizing my sewing experience, but I thought this video was definitely worth making because I got a lot of questions, and since I do share sewing videos on my Instagram and on my TikTok, I thought everyone who watches me only deserves to know how I got started, so we can all be on this journey together and support each other. Again, thank you so much for watching. You can subscribe if you want to see more of me, more of the stories I have to tell, maybe some more sewing, I don't know. But if you want to see more of me on the weekly basis, that's guaranteed. You can go follow my vlog channel, which is called Choose. I upload every single week. If you aren't following me on Instagram and TikTok yet, where I post reels and TikToks on sewing and fashion and lifestyle, check them out at Yusuf Reinhardt. And otherwise, I'll see you somewhere around, and I wish you the best on your sewing journey. Bye!